What's going on, guys? Welcome to Victims and Villains. If you guys are new to our content, we create content like what you're watching right now, simply to educate and engage individuals like yourselves on mental health awareness and suicide prevention. My name is Captain Nostalgia. I am a writer, podcaster, and the director of our film festival called Horrific Hope. If you guys would really like more information about who we are, how to support us via Patreon or donations, podcasts, more movie reviews like this, links to our social medias, and more, including our mental health resource library, click the links in the descriptions below. And if you're a filmmaker and would like to submit your nightmares, whether they are shorts, features, or screenplays, hit the link in the description as well. Now, it's been a while since we've covered Shudder content, and I deeply apologize for that. It is my hopes to get back into creating more Shudder content and giving you guys our thoughts before the films hit the platform, and what better way to do it than with the movie Revealer, which hits the platform everywhere beginning on June 23rd, this upcoming Thursday. Revealer tells the story of a dancer and a religious zealot that essentially have to band together and face off the apocalypse. It's also worth mentioning that this movie takes place in 1987, a couple years after the hype of Satanic Panic. If that's not enough to kind of get you in the mood for this movie, this is also written from Tim Seeley. He's the co-writer on this movie. And if you don't know that name, he is actually the man responsible for the book Hack Slash and the series for creating this in the late 90s / early 2000s. Let me begin by saying that the look and the color palette of this movie is absolutely exceptional. The way that Mandy was able to really weave in a lot of reds and purples, this movie does that exactly the same way, and it allows the tension to not only be heightened, but also the neon appeal of it really prepares you and kind of sets you in the 80s, the 80s aesthetic that this movie is going for. This movie is gorgeous, absolutely stunning. It feels like an alternative world of Stranger Things, or like at least the color palette of, like, imagine taking the color aesthetic of the Upside Down and kind of condensing it into like a more of like an 80s appeal supernatural movie, and that's the way this movie looks. Probably Stranger Things 3 more than anything else, because you have the neon of the mall involved with the Upside Down, and this movie just looks visually very stunning and very satisfying. So this movie has a really small cast, and primarily you only follow the two protagonists, who are played by Caito Aase. They are billed in the film as Caitlin Aase and Shaina Schrooten. There are a couple of other characters that you will see and meet throughout the duration of the film, but you primarily follow these two characters. One of the things I think this film does so intelligently is take both of these characters, who are a juxtaposition of one another, and allows them to really grow in some surprisingly hilarious, heartfelt, but also like really like almost tear-jerking moments. Character development is at the top of the list of things the Revealer does extremely well. Like, I will say, it's been a long time, it feels like, since I've come across a movie in the subgenre of horror that's supernatural and borderline religious that has this great of character development. Like, character development feels like it was a top priority, and if the characters don't feel developed from point A to point B, then it almost kind of feels like there's no emotional connection between the audience and characters. And the writers of this movie, Seeley and Moreci, do a phenomenal job at creating that emotional impact between the audience and the characters. Aase and Schrooten really do have both great chemistry together, but also at the same time they have a great rivalry that is just allows for some just amazing performances from both actors. This movie's paced extraordinarily well. Even when there are times that the movie does feel like it's lagging, it never stays like dormant. It is always constantly moving at a brisk pace. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron, but it does. Like, there are moments where the film starts to feel like it's heading for a lag, and then boom, something exciting happens that reinvigorates your interest in these characters. This movie does tension really well, and again, it's been a long time since I have felt a tension of this kind when watching this movie. Like, this tension almost brought me to legitimately being scared. And it's very rare that I come across horror movies that do that, and Revealer does that, and a couple times throughout this movie beautifully. Let's not forget, this soundtrack is absolutely bumping. This movie feels like it is taking not only a page out of the 80s book, but also out of John Carpenter's discography, and it creates a really just awesome soundtrack. Like, this soundtrack might be one of my favorite scores of the year when it comes to movies. I loved where this movie took me emotionally. There are several times where I found myself actually laughing. This movie does comedy extremely well, whereas other movies that I've seen more recently that have tried to integrate horror and comedy together have just fell flat, and it comes across as really cringy humor, and it's just really awkward at the end of the day. I love that this movie brought me to the edge of my seat, and on top of that, actually almost like brought me to tears through some of the more sensible moments this movie creates. I will say, though, that I do have a few complaints about this movie, and this movie harkens on some of my biggest pet peeves in the medium of film. First, I'm gonna say the CGI in this movie is just kind of alright. I think this movie does practical effects spectacularly, but when it is aiming to do these small little sequences of digital effects, it just looks really bad. And I know in the grand scale of things, that's literally not something to like focus in on, because it's very small and it's a very, very minor detail, but it's the way that it's lit. It makes it, the budgetary restraints are presented very obviously. But like, had those scenes been lit just a little bit differently, or had the reddish tint that the majority of this movie has versus the blinking lights, and you'll see it when it hits the streaming service this Thursday, I feel like those scenes could have been handled a lot better, and this complaint would have been moot. One of my biggest pet peeves when it comes to movies is when you reach the end and you get this thing where there are what feels like multiple endings, where you feel like the movie's ended, and then plot twist, it hasn't quite ended yet, and then you go a little bit further and you think it's ended again, and then plot twist, it keeps going. And this movie has that. This movie does that probably 3 or 4 times in the last 15-20 minutes. It's a very minor complaint, but every time that I felt like, oh, this is the end, and I was satisfied with that, then there was something that came up that undid that ending, and I had to reconcile with the fact that the movie was going to keep going. This, to me, the reason why it's such a big complaint is because when you have a movie that's less than an hour and a half, like Revealer, it just feels like they're extending the runtime, when you could have perfectly satisfied a great emotional connection to these characters and send off as well, but you just kind of felt like you had the need to keep going. Let's run this through our Rorschach rating scale, though. This one I'm going to go ahead and give a 4 out of 5. I truly loved almost everything about this movie. I think the performances are great, the pacing's great, the emotional connection is great, the comedy's great, tension's great. This movie looks visual, the soundtrack, the score, everything about this movie is just almost perfect. It's just those very few minor things that prevent it from being a little bit better than it could be, but who knows? On multiple rewatches, this movie might end up being one of my favorites of the year, but for right now, it's a 4 out of 5. And now it's time for our mental health moment. If you're new to our content, mental health moment is where we take a theme of mental health and we bring it out of the movie to expand upon it for a few moments, and in the hopes to deconstruct the stigma surrounding mental health. As I've previously mentioned, the two characters at odds in the beginning of this movie that ultimately end up having to band together to fight the apocalypse. You have a stripper in one corner and you have a religious protester in the other corner. And if you know anything about either world, you know that they are polar opposites. One of the things that I think this movie does really well in terms of the character developments and character growth of both of these characters is understanding that not to judge a book by its cover, but actually getting to know the person. Because at the end of the day, that judgment and those head clashes, doesn't matter how headstrong you are, that affects your mental health. I'm coming from a guy that is absolutely covered in tattoos, is a Christian, watches horror movies, and listens to heavy, bonkers music. I have faced a lot of judgment in the church, and it personally has taken its toll on me. Early on in my journey of getting into horror and metal and getting tattoos, and also being a Christian, I had longer hair. I wore darker makeup. I also painted I still paint my nails, but I also had to face with that a lot of that judgment, a lot of that criticism, and it's not fun getting to be judged simply by your outside appearance. And I think sometimes we get so caught up in that we forget that at the end of that day, under all of those outer layers, that there's a person in the midst of that, and that person has feelings, and that person also has a mental health journey. And that judgment actually has an effect on that mental health and the way that they also view themselves. Angie is the name of the dancer in this movie, and Sally is the name of the religious protester in this movie. And throughout the entire course of this movie, Sally is constantly harassing and judging Angie, and you're kind of getting to see how all of the years of that judgment really takes its toll on Angie. But also at the same time, it allows the character growth of Sally to truly see Angie as a person. And honestly, I encourage people to always consider the person at the core. Don't just cast judgment. Honestly understand and know who that person is at the end of the day. Not just merely for the music they listen to, the clothes that they wear, or the movies that they watch, or video games that they play, or the passions that they have. Because at the end of the day, we all are on the same mental health journey. The challenge coming out of Revealer is to think before you judge, because you don't know what that person is going through. You don't know what their journey is or why they're into the things that they're in. Listen and ask questions and grow in relationship with those individuals. And as always, if you or someone you know is listening or watching this right now and you need help, you're struggling with mental health, depression, suicide, addiction, self-harm, anxiety, I'll click the links in the descriptions below and check out our mental health resource library. You can check out Revealer when it hits Shudder exclusively this Thursday, June 23rd. Thank you guys for watching.